סוד. זה סוד. באתי להגיד שלום, כי אני לא משנה. באנו לפני שבועות היום יום סידור קונטיינר, לתאם בין העובדים של כולם. יוצאים בלספר את העניין.
נשלח תוכנית של הסמינר האסלאם, נכון? טוב, יאללה.
So far in apology from the Professor Islam that cannot be today because he's abroad, but we can make sure to be present in some of the discussions and also in the lectures in the future. Students that are enrolled to the course, please remain here after on the lecture and the short discussion after it is ending. Okay. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the opening lecture of the school. Today's seminar is going to be given by Professor Gideon Avni. She's the former chief archaeologist for the Israel Antiquities Authority and emeritus professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and currently a research fellow at the Archaeological Institute for Maritime Studies here in the university. Its academic interests focus on various aspects of classical, late antique, and Islamic archaeology, the archaeology of Jerusalem and its hinterlands, nomads and sedentary societies in the desert areas of the Near East, and Mediterranean connectivity in late antiquity. During the past 40 years, he conducted extensive fieldwork in the Negev Desert, and the Judean lowlands, Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and various excavations in and around, and in Ramla, the capital of the early Islamic Palestine. He has authored 6 monographs and more than 150 articles, and his recent books are The Byzantine Islamic Transition in Palestine, an Archaeological Approach, and published in 2014 by Oxford University Press, and the Old City, Jerusalem in the late Roman period, published in 2017 by Rhode Island Press. As far as I know, there is another book with the late, right? Okay. Today, he will share with us his broad perspective about Negev Connectivity and Late Antiquity. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gideon. Thank you. Okay, for inviting me to the seminar. What I'm going to do in the next minutes, an hour or so, is trying to share with you some general ideas about a region, the Negev, as you can see here, and its function
in a much wider geopolitical context. In a much wider geopolitical context in a specific period. As I said, it's based on quite a few years of fieldwork in the Negev. Actually, I started my career many years ago in the Negev in the framework of what was called the emergency survey of the Negev, following the redeployment of Israeli army in the Negev Desert and so on. And in recent years, actually it's been almost 10 years that I'm working in cooperation with Guy Baroz in Gilgambash. It started with the Guy's ELC project on the Negev, and we're working together, sharing ideas, and maybe trying to bring the Negev knowledge to wider aspects, to wider audiences. And this will be in many ways also the focus of my presentation. I will be speaking on the Negev, but trying to put it into a larger context, and we'll see through the introduction what does it mean. But first of all, I would like to frame the chronology or the time span we'll be speaking about. Generally, it will cover a large section of the first millennium BC. As you can see here, I chose two very distinctive imperial reflections or periods in the Negev between Justinian, the mid of the 6th century, the last phase when the Byzantine Empire was kind of an empire, including the Negev, and the late 8th, early 9th century, Harun al-Rashid, when the whole geopolitical situation of the Near East was completely changed. Of course, the transition from Christian to Islamic rule, Byzantine to Abbasid Caliphate, and in between, this map represents one of, I would say, most significant events in world history, for sure in Eurasian history. The Arab conquest, 7 years in all, that practically reshaped the Near East, reopened the borders, and that will be one of my main themes of this discussion. But if I'm going back to the headline of this lecture, when we speak about connectivity, especially connectivity in desert areas, so I guess one would figure these caravans crossing large distances, sometimes small ones, 6 to 8 camels, donkeys, some much larger ones. And in a way, I will try also to challenge this perception along this talk, because when you look at the very large literature that has been addressing the issue of connectivity, so the connection to roads or to routes is very evident. First of all, it goes by the material. Of course, we have the spice road, the silk, the amber routes in Northern Europe, the salt routes crossing the Sahara. Then we have imperial influences, Roman roads, probably the most sophisticated, extensive, pre-designed and built roads that covered large section of Mediterranean Europe, the Near East, and so on. King's Highway, pilgrim routes. I guess everybody knows about the Camino to Santiago de Compostela. Some people even walked sections of these areas. So if we, for a minute, try to generalize this concept of connectivity through routes, I just brought this schematic plan of the so-called Silk Roads. So we're speaking about movement of people, of ideas, of technologies, products, plant species artifacts may be the major tool for archaeologists to distinguish and measure activity. Now, just to try to show what does it mean to measure connectivity, this map represents a minute in world history. Again, the map of the Byzantine Empire, the mid-6th century, and all these black dots you see on the map are points in which artifacts belonging to the Byzantine Empire have been discovered outside the limits of the empire. So Europe, Central Northern Europe, the British Islands is quite clear, close to the empire. But if you look to other locations like East Africa, the kingdom of Axum, was a Christian kingdom in Africa. You look at southern India, the areas of the Malabar coast between Goa and Cochin, and you look even, you can distinguish even far locations such as Central Asia, China. By the way, most of these dots in China represent glass artifacts of Byzantine origin. In order to understand what does it mean, especially the faraway location, I would like to represent one single point, one of the most remotest places in which Byzantine and artifacts have been found, and this is in the middle of the Mongolian steppes. These rolling hills and the small artificial hills, mounds, which represent burial caves. There's a distinctive way how to reach the opening of the cave. You can see it here. 6th century cave, completely preserved. When you open this door, this is what you see. Inside a typical burial customs, Mongolian, very strong Chinese influences. So you have the figurines, you have other materials, you have representations of camels, of course, Bactrian camels, textiles, and among this, suddenly, you would find this coin, minted in Constantinople, Heraclius, early 7th century, 8,000 kilometers from this very remote location in Mongolia. You can even see the typical, the Golgotha, the place of crucifixion, reaching all the way from our region to the heart of Mongolia. So what's going on here? How this artifact reached Mongolia? Now it goes to the other way around. If you go to the island of Helgö, not far away from Stockholm, southern Sweden, there's a treasure of artifacts from different locations, including this small statue representing Buddha. You can see how small is it through this replica. And again, the same period, mid-6th century, and then comes the question, how did it arrive all the way from somewhere in northern India, Central Asia, to Sweden? Is it just an anecdote? Is it something beyond this? What does it mean about connectivity? I can take you to many more examples like this, but let's go to something which has a much stronger presence, speaking about shipwrecks. So this is the story of a ship which is called the Tang treasure ship, or the belly tomb ship, that was wrecked in the Straits of Java Sea, along the maritime route that leads, goes all the way from China through the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, to the Near East, the Gulf area, or Egypt. So in this particular ship, which sunk in the year 130 CE, huge amount of artifacts have been found, almost 70,000 of them. If you want to see them, you should visit Singapore, the Museum of Maritime Civilization in Singapore. It was an interesting story how the ship was excavated. It was done by a private company who funded all this and then made a kind of bid, and the Singaporean government decided to buy this. The sunken ship itself, it's not a Chinese ship. It's a typical dome. It's a typical Arabian ship of the early Islamic period. And when you look at the thousands of artifacts, 65,000 porcelain, ceramic, Chinese vessels, many of them designed in something that looked to the Chinese artists like acoustic inscriptions. It means that it was pre-ordered by somebody or some entities sitting in the Near East, if you want, the very first cargo of AliExpress, but is being produced in China in order to supply the Western markets. And again, the question is, how did it work? Who was interested in this? Of course, there is the economic issue. Somebody earned a lot of money for this transportation. You can find, this was not one ship, it's a network. And you can find this type of vessels in Fustat in Egypt, in Ramle, here in Israel, in Damascus, in very large quantities in the Gulf countries of today. So again, it comes to the question of connectivity. How did it work? Who functioned it? And what is the meaning of the intermediate region? Now, the last example before coming back to the Negev takes us to the western fringe of, again, the post-Byzantine area, King Offa. Western England, Wales, actually, somebody knows the term Offa's Dyke. It's a very large fortification system, which was done by this particular ruler, exists until today. And the connectivity issue goes through a network of coins. So these are typical Abbasid coins, golden dinars. You can maybe even read the Shahada in Arabic, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. But in the other side of this coin, you can see the Latin inscriptions, Offa Rex, the King Offa. And the whole idea was to create a monetary system that will facilitate the trade between the far west of Europe and the Middle East, Central Asia, using the common denomination, like buying dollars or issuing dollars in order, or euros in order to circulate, in order to pay through the buying commodities somewhere in Central Asia. Now, if you ask, okay, this is very interesting, but what is the connection to the Negev? So this example exists in many regions, including at our backyard. This is Tel Marsata, or Molata, the Byzantine town located right near the Tel. Today is in the airbase of Nevatim. In a very recent rescue excavations conducted by the Antiquities Authority, published by Noah Michael, this figurine, you can judge just by looking. It did not come from a kind of Semitic origin in the Near East. The Near East is coming from Africa, probably south of the Sahara, in the 4th, 5th century. And again, the question is, how did it work? How all this system of exchange and the delivery of artifacts work, and how it is connected to the road system, which I told you in the beginning. One of the ideas of this presentation is to challenge it. In order to do this, I'm using knowledge acquired by archaeologists and historians working in Central Asia, Mongolia, and China. This is an article published by Ursula Brossenberg and Brian Miller, an archaeologist and historian working in Mongolia. And as you can see here, continental connectivity too often maintain notions of contact that assert continental cultural poles in system of dominant center, which means one center deliver goods to the other center. Instead, pan-Eurasian exchange should be thought on in terms of decentral complex web that not only span famous oases or centers, but the so-called the Silk Road, but reach deep into steppe regions of Eurasia. Not only Eurasia, but also the Near East. So rather than trans-Eurasian exchanges between East and West powers, we should refocus and broaden our approach to pan-Eurasian interchange amongst all the various groups and regions. Now, with this saying, which I believe should be adopted not only to this interconnectivity through the so-called Silk Roads or routes, but much more broadly, we can zoom in again to the Negev, but not yet to the details, but looking at the Negev as a kind of a part of or link in this system of interaction and connectivity. Now, the fact that the Negev belonged to the Mediterranean sphere from one hand and to the Near Eastern desert surrounding from another end, it's very clear, and it has been very much emphasized in quite a number of recent work that were dealing or summarizing the Mediterranean during Late Antiquity, Roman to Late Antiquity, more or less between the year 250 and the year 1000. I believe those of you who are more into these periods know these books. One of them, The Corrupting Sea, Peregrine Holden and Nicholas Parcel, take all the available data from the Mediterranean until the turn of the century, the year 2000, and trying to describe different regions and reconnect or connect them into one web. The same Chris Wickham is framing the early Middle Ages. Most of these studies are based on a book by this person down here, Peter Brown, probably the founding father of the concept of late antiquity as a major period in European Mediterranean history. So the Negev is very much embedded now within this system. But what's happened when we're trying to look eastward about connectivity that does not look as we used to do in many periods, mainly in Israeli archaeology, looking at the Levant as part of a Mediterranean network. What's happened when you are looking to the East? First of all, we're not looking at the East in most of the studies. When you see the historiography of historical archaeological, not only in Israel, but generally in the Mediterranean, we very rarely look at the Eastern options. There are many reasons for this. I can take you to one of the historiographical aspects, which was raised by many scholars, among them this person, Jack Goody. He was an anthropologist and historian working in Cambridge, a very productive scholar, as you can see from his many books. For example, he wrote, to my opinion, a beautiful book about the culture of flowers. How come that flowers in a certain society became a major artifact in which you represent in weddings, funerals, occasions, and so on, and in other culture, it is not represented at all. He wrote about cooking, cuisine, class. You can devote a whole lecture about his works, but one of his main issues, he worked both in Africa and in Asia as an anthropologist. And he wrote a number of books, including a summarizing article about what he called the Eurocentric approach into historical anthropological research. He even called it the theft of history. Like you are looking only at Europe, only at the Mediterranean, but the whole exists to the east. And when you browse the, at least the archaeological literature of the periods I'm speaking about, it is very evident that actually there are two worlds working almost separately: the Asian, Central, Eastern Asian, and the European, Mediterranean. They are not connecting between them, and this connectivity is being raised only quite recently through this movement of artifacts, ideas, and so on. But if you look at the system of research 50 to 100 years ago, it's very rarely exists. Now, after this long introduction, we really go on focusing more into the Negev, and first of all asking why the Negev matters, why particularly this area becomes a kind of unique laboratory in which you can or you should address this much larger question. First of all, it's the intensiveness of research. All these names you see here, starting from Palmer 150 years ago, going on until today, and probably I skipped or missed some scholars, which I apologize for. But this is only to show you that in terms of database, this has been one of the most explored areas, looking at the Levant, even looking at the whole Mediterranean basin. It's on the fringe zone between from the desert and the sun. It is a subject of many effects of collapse, continuity, change, transitions. The numbers you see here are the dates of the meaningful events in the history of the Negev: the Roman annexation 106, the pagan Christian transition, the Islamic conquest 634, and so on. So this aspect also makes the Negev so significant. There's been a very large field work conducted in the Negev. Many excavations, the so-called Negev towns, the extensive archaeological survey, one of the largest of its kind, covering segments, large segments stretching from Beersheba all the way down to Eilat. So this is one of the aspects by which the Negev is particularly significant. For this end, in addition to the archaeological area, it has also a treasure of historical documentation. The archives of Nitzana, which provide many details about private and public life in a village in the Negev. In addition, in recent years, the similar archive is being published from Petra. So now let's see more specifically how this connectivity is being expressed, and we start from the obvious one, the routes, the roads, the incense routes, which is very well marked, at least in the Negev. It has in certain sections even milestones in the Roman tradition. It has been quite extensively excavated. Udovkoye, Negev Israel, Taligeni, starting from the 1980s. Actually, most of the road stations along the incense routes have been excavated. For example, Moa or Moyat Awan, which includes a fortress, a caravanserai for this desert caravan, and other section including agriculture, which currently is being explored by some new methodology. The recent contribution of Guy Laurent's team was to look at this section not from the point of view of architecture and this very formal buildings, but trying to look about the economy, about the dietary habits of the population through this garbage archaeology methodology, which was implied in many places in the Negev, including in the ancient route. But when you think about this route as crossing a region, you should not think of the road crossing an empty space. And that was the topic of an article led by Gil Gambash, which I also included in the reading material of this seminar, and which we entitled Think Outside the Road, because this road is crossing a region which is very active in many, many other aspects. You can see in that map over there the artifacts. We have pottery, the fine Byzantine pottery, we have seashells, we have fabrics, we have fish, which makes a very interesting point to show that this area actually acts as a region and not as a line crossing and empty region. If you take, for example, the fish, one of the sub-projects by Galgo's team, so these fish were imported into the Negev. Of course, you don't have fish in the Negev highland, but many of them comes from the Red Sea and from the Nile, which means they have to cross large distances for a very common, maybe luxury, but a commodity that was consumed by a large group of people living in this area, not necessarily connected to some exotic spices coming through the spice route. Textiles present a very interesting means of cultural encounters, and you do have evidence of textiles mainly in the desert region, including the Negev, showing provenance, origins, and the way they were transmitted again to these particular villages and not as parts of the road network. Then, especially in the Negev, southern Jordan, or more generally the southern Levant, we're dealing with a region which has other components affecting its settlements, its diversity, and the possibility to crossing it. So I just put two of them, the so-called nomadic threat, settlers and nomads. Actually, it's not a threat, as you'll see in a minute, and the fact that this area is located in the fringe of the Roman and later Byzantine Empire. What does it mean when you have to use this area as an area of connectivity? It relates to issues of core and periphery, the Mediterranean area, and the desert surroundings, the nomad settlers interactions, and the ranges we're speaking about is between 30 to 200 kilometers. So again, it's more local aspects of this region. Now, speaking about nomads, we have these ethnographic descriptions existing from the 19th century. Alois Mosil, the Czech explorer, who dedicated many of his publication to the issue of the nomads in the desert, looking at it a bit from a romantic point of view. There are many discussions that try to connect the ancient nomads and Bedouins to biblical description, to late antique nomads. You can see all the publication going on for almost 100 years. Recently, Erez Ben Yosef was trying to address the role of nomads in encountering the empire. But I would like to mention very briefly only two great scholars. One of them, Ibn Khaldun from the 14th century, emphasizing that the nomads need the city for the necessities and the urban population needs the Bedouins for conveniences and luxuries. The interconnectivity between these to a component which are completely different in their social relationship, because the tribal bondings of the nomads, of the Bedouins, was very different from the ones of, let's say, the settlers or the people from the Mediterranean area. And 600 years later, Anatoly Khazanov, who wrote probably the most significant textbooks about nomads and the relationships with the outside world. And you can see that nomads were never autarkic, and therefore in economic, cultural, and political respects were dependent on the relations with the sedentary world. So there's another aspect of connectivity when you take this down to real life in the Negev, in the Byzantine Negev. So apart from archaeological findings, you have several descriptions by travelers and pilgrims relating to their encounter with the local population of nomads. For example, this one, we are in the year 570 CE, a group of Christian pilgrims coming from Piacenza, Italy, and they have crossing the desert from Gaza to Elusa, and going to the Holy Mountain in Sinai. And this is why they encounter in the way. They have to cross the desert, and they have camels with them, with water. And then they have to confront all kinds of experiences, some of them dangerous to their eyes. Families of Saracens, the Romans, suddenly appear from the desert, sitting on the roadside, dressed in rags, begging for bread from the travelers. The men emerge from the desert, bringing skin with cold water, giving us in exchange of bread, and so on and so on. So this encounter, which you can take a 19th century explorer traveling the desert, it would produce a very similar one. Somebody coming from Europe, never been in a desert in his life, and this is how he or she experiencing this area in which you have settlers and nomads, the settled population in the north and the nomads in the south, interacting in between themselves and forming this region of connectivity, in which, in the period we're speaking about, they're experiencing collapse, continuity, change, and transformation in many ways, which affect their surrounding settlements and so on. And of course, we have all these interactions reflected in the finds, both in the large cities and in the countryside, the area of the domain, if you want, of the nomads. I would like to put into this picture another component, and this is the ancient agriculture of the Negev, or the Byzantine agriculture of the Negev, looking how it also contributed to this connectivity between the Negev and the outer regions. So first of all, the Negev agriculture is very prominent. Whenever you travel in the Negev highlands in a good season after some rain, not like in the recent years, you will see these views. Some of these systems are still irrigated and worked by the local Bedouins. And whenever you try to treat and describe an agricultural system like the Negev, there are the 4W, as we call it. Who made it? When it was done? What was the reason for creating such large intervention, human intervention, which requires many means, many working days? And what was wrong there? And you can add another one, is where does the knowledge coming from? Is it an independent invention, or did they acquire this knowledge from outside? To make a long story short, there's almost 60 years of continuous research about this agricultural system, including some very recent works, as you can see here. So we know how did they function, you know their hydrological bases, how they collected water, and we particularly know the system of ownership, which is reflected in the Messana papyri, and also the dating, which is important to trying to locate this system within the geopolitical structure of the Negev in late antiquity. So the dating, unlike traditional methodologies, was provided by research which dated terraces directly, not through circumstantial evidence, not through villages or settlements nearby, but by an OSL, optical simulated luminescence, dating of this anthropogenic man-made accumulation. The bottom line was that the whole agricultural system, or maybe not the whole, but 90% of the fields you see today in the Negev highlands were constructed between the 4th and the 7th, 8th century and continued to function until the 9th, maybe even the 10th century, which puts all this system into one geopolitical economic system. There's been a lot of discussions about Nabatean archaeology, Nabatean agriculture. So at least from this dating, you cannot forget about it, but Nabatean agriculture was very much restricted to smaller areas near the springs and not widely distributed throughout the whole Negev Highlands. Now, about the question of what was grown there, just again, the research, the very recent research conducted by Guy Bowers and other scholars, pointing out that the main product was viniculture, the growing of grapes. We have various data to prove this. The growth in the number of grape seeds during the Byzantine period, the height is around the year 550, and then a decline. It goes also with the large amount of storage jars. And of course, evidence of production. The wine presses, taking the grapes into the wine press, producing wine, and the transportation, which brings us again to the topics of connectivity, not over such a large distances, but if you have a vineyard, you produce wine, somebody, the truck driver, has to take your commodities to sell it somewhere. And this is where we meet Orbicon, not the truck, but the camel driver, who uses the loads of amphora, typical Byzantine amphora, to deliver the wine from the production centers, either in the Negev or in closer areas to the Gaza and Ashkelon, and from there to the Mediterranean. So speaking about Mediterranean networks, this is one of the main aspects that we should look at. Again, the recent works by Guy group and Al that show the destination areas of this large wine productivity. And of course, it is connected to a much larger network of the land behind Gaza and Ashkelon, the historical sources that mention the sweet gifts of Bacchus, and so on and so forth. So Palestine in general and the Negev in particular were very much connected to this Mediterranean system or networks. I'm not going to take you into the details of this chart that summarizes all the components and aspects that are involved in this production. So we see that the Negev in many ways is part of this Mediterranean network through commerce, through influences, maybe also through the technologies of irrigation that are spread not only in the Negev, but also in North Africa. What about the East? That will be the last part of my talk. As I said in the beginning, the looking eastward was very much neglected for many years in all fields of research, including archaeology, but the possibility to look eastward and to connect the East and the West is directly connected to this global change. The fact that in the 6th century, the limit of empire was also the limit of possibilities to travel, to walk, or to cross eastward, while in the 9th century, a person, if he wanted to, could have started walking or taking his camel from Kashgar in Western China, Samarkand in Central Asia, and walking all the way to Spain without crossing any political boundary. So that was very significant in the possibility to increase connectivity between East and West. I'm not going to take you into the complicated topic of how this change was made. There are several possibilities that were being made along historical research, from the fact that the Arab conquest destroyed everything. That was the common view until the 90s, 80s, to different approaches that were triggered mainly by archaeological findings. So it started with the kind of decline of form following the Roman Empire, but then scholars like Hugh Kennedy showed that productivity, urbanism, settlement continued, and we are more or less established now in a very in a scheme of a very long process that took something like 400 years, in which you have its ups and downs, the decline after the conquest, and then intensification during the Abbasid period. When you look at the settlement picture of Palestine, comparing the 6th century to the 9th and 10th century, even if we don't go into the details, you can see more or less the same density of settlements. They change the character, they change the pattern, but they still remain. Now, within this, we can distinguish trends of connectivity that connect the Eastern world, the Central Asian, Western China world with the Near East. I'm going to present briefly only two of them. The first goes to agricultural technologies. If you do Google Earth in different locations, mainly the steppe and desert areas of North Africa, then Near East, Central Asia, China, you'll see these kind of pictures. These are not moles digging in the ground. It goes to one of the most sophisticated, unique systems of irrigation through underground channels. The idea is very simple: how to bring water from aquifer to large distances and provide the possibility to irrigate dry areas with water that comes from far away. All these names you see down here, the Kanat, Fogal, Karez, Afraj, are the different names given to these systems in different parts of Eurasia. Now, the source is very clear. The source of the Kanat technology comes from the Iranian plateau, maybe at the same time from Oman. We're speaking about the 2nd millennium BC, and the spread goes in waves in different periods. There's a spread in the Near East in a number of periods, mainly the early Islamic period, but the most interesting thing is how these Kanats, which are recognized as World Heritage, featured by UNESCO, how they spread from their origin in Iran or in the Gulf area into remote locations like the Tarim Basin in Western China. You have thousands of them spread all over, producing the possibility to create agriculture, particularly viniculture in these areas. And again, you can look at satellite pictures, you can visit these sites at the place. And there's been in the past 10 years quite a number of works that try to date the time of installation and maintenance of this system, and in many parts, both in the East, speaking about Kazakhstan, Western China, and in the West, speaking about Spain, we are looking roughly the same period we're speaking about, following the Arab conquest, mainly between the 8th and the 10th century. Modern works do this by, again, OSL dating of the spills that were produced from digging this shaft in order to create the horizontal tunnel. And one of the key points for this transmission of the technology, it is something that it is almost impossible to invent, because you need a very large hydrological knowledge in order to produce these long tunnels. One of the connecting points is right here in the Negev, in the Arab Valley. We have a number of sites like Enevona, Yotmeta, along the Rift Valley, also in the Jericho area, in which new settlements, new agricultural states were created using, for the first time, this Kanat technology. These settlements are very well dated, starting in the early to mid 8th century and going existing until the 10th or the 11th century. All of them are constructed in the driest areas of the country. This is again an advantage, so you can reconstruct a major phase of this Eurasian exchange through technology by tracing the Kanat system all the way from the Near East westward to North Africa and Spain, eastward to Central Asia and China. Last example I would like to conclude with takes us back again to the trash mounds of the Ara Valley, Nahal Omer, which seems to be one of the most significant sites, I would say, in the history of the Near East during early Islamic, early medieval periods. And the reason, or the surprise, this is a very remote, off the beaten track site. It is located along the incense routes, which at least during this period did not function as a main route. And from the first look, it looks like any ordinary sites in the Negev. We have hundreds of them from this period. It was excavated in the mid-1990s. I would say violently excavated, because using the methodology of that not so far away time, this excavation was concentrating mainly in the architecture. So you see the architecture of the village. There is a mosque, an open mosque located in its middle. The population is, of course, Islamic. And even in this excavation, something very unique appeared. A very large quantities of organic material, specifically textiles, concentrating in a number of large garbage heaps around in the site. That was the reason why, it was 2021, if I'm not wrong, the Negev team, or the garbage Negev team of the Negev, came back to Nahal Omer, excavating not the architecture, not the site, but the garbage heaps. And as you can see from these periods, thousands of artifacts has been discovered, a very large range of seeds, grains, cereals, wood, basketry, date palms, and huge fields for research. But the main issue was papyrus fragments with some Arabic inscription, maybe evidence of what perhaps is one of the oldest papers introduced into the Near East. You know that the introduction of paper, the same paper we're writing now, into our region is dated to somewhere in the 8th century following the Arab conquest. This is something that has to be proven, but the main evidence for connectivity comes from the textile. I'm not going to take you into all this issue. You can see many of them right here in the laboratory in Haifa. Shamir is working on this material, but it gives another very strong evidence to this Eastern connectivity, taking us through the designs, for example, to India, to the Ajanta and Ellora caves, one of the most famous caves with the wall paintings which show similar designs. And it also represents the potentiality of looking eastward along these networks, which brings me back to this statement challenging the approach of one-way or two-way route connecting two points. You can call it the Marco Polo approach, starting from one point, ending in another point, by speaking about something which connects region and connects, as I say, exactly as I say here, interchanges among all the various groups and regions along large distances. What is the meaning for this? And with this, I'm going to end. We see in the Near East from the 2nd millennium BC evidence for stuff coming from the Far East. We have this exotic materials. Ayelet Gilboa is not here, but she is responsible for one of the research, the beginning of South Asian spice trade. And we're speaking about the 2nd millennium BC, and the question is, how did it happen? If you go in time and look at recent works that were done along the line of world system, so I would recommend Philippe Boujard, who wrote the whole history of the Indian Ocean and the neighboring regions from the perspective of networks, and you can see the lines here, each one of them representing networks that are very much interconnected within each other. Another famous work, Janet Abulud, which looks at the world in the 13th, 14th century, and again, it draws these very large lines of system. You can see that many of them connect in the Negev, not in the only period. So this is where the future of research, to my opinion, lies. Take this laboratory of the Negev, take the RODA data, which been accumulated for the past almost 100 years, and use it in a wider perspective, continuing looking at the Mediterranean, but also filling the gap of looking eastward and trying to see when and how this Eurasian exchange system developed and how it really looked like is speaking from the point of view of material culture. Thank you.
Very much, Gideon, for the fascinating lecture. Are there any questions or comments? Yes.
First of all, thank you very much. This was amazing. I wanted to ask, I saw the part of date is very old in the 10th or 9th century.
Again, I didn't hear.
Is the cut-off date? You mentioned this research it's in the 9th and 10th centuries. The Fatimid Empire in any way take roots?
Well, yes and no, because there are gaps in this big picture. One of the gaps is Egypt, because Egypt behaves differently in many, many periods. So even when you look at Egypt in the Byzantine in the early Islamic period, the system and the fact that it's organized along the Nile for centuries, it brings that also the Fatimid about the 9th and 10th century, they were very much focused in Egypt. They got these artifacts. I mean, when you look at Fustat, you see these Chinese materials going all the way until the 10th, 11th century when Fustat declined and Cairo raises. But how effective the Fatimids were in this Eurasian connection, it's nobody looked at it particular, but I think that it was the Fatimid system was going more oriented with North Africa rather than with Central Asia. The trigger for Central Asia connectivity goes mainly from the fact that the Abbasid Empire connected this region, and then you have other influences like the picture I saw in the beginning, these gold and dinars, which were part of the Viking trade, Central Asia going to the north. There's huge thousands upon thousands of Abbasid coins in Northern Europe. So the Fatimid would be a little bit excluded from this system.
Question. Was in the period of Alexander the Great, with cinnamon, for example, came all the way to the east, to the west. So there was a major connectivity, maybe it's because of the empire. Did you think about comparing those things to the connection that you just spoke about it? Because it's the same.
Yeah. Well, there are events that enhance or emphasize this connectivity. Alexander the Great, born in the east, reaching the fringe of India, is one of them. That was the time, as far as I know, that elements in Greek art, mythology, were penetrating eastward. But when you speak about the not the exotic materials, but about these technologies of irrigation, which every farmer is used to adopt them. If we're speaking about foodstuff, we didn't speak about it, but there's a lot of exchange in foodstuff. Then the process can be triggered by a political event like the Arab conquest, which opened the border. But then it's a much longer term process, which is affected from all this network creating. So, of course, when once physically the West comes to the East, like in Alexander times, it really provides a trigger. And that was, by the way, the first time when you see Qanats penetrating to North Africa is the Hellenistic period. So there are several waves that create this. For sure, it helped, but we're speaking about a system that it's not dependent on a single event of like 10 years, Alexander, or 7 years, the Islamic conquest, but open a much longer processes.
The big carbon, what were the payment terms from far areas?
I'm nothing because it depends. If you're going to what has been written, so for example, the SIP has a mean of payment. I guess that Itzhak knows more than I do about it. So exotic commodities, which does not weigh too much, can be loaded on camels, on donkeys, or whatever, were transmitted. In Megiddo and Tel Aviv, you have this material from the 2nd millennium BC. The idea of connectivity that I'm speaking about is more about mass production. That ship that was carrying thousands upon thousands of vessels. So it means that the question is at what point the market is being influenced at such a way that it's worthwhile to produce, to transport, and to sell this very large item, and at what point the technologies are being transferred and then adopted in a very, very large, by very large population, like these carets in China, you see them by the thousands in a very large area. So there's a difference between the exotic material travel and the ordinary foodstuff, the wine, traveling to the west and also to the east. So I think this should be the differentiation. In archaeology, it's very difficult to trace these exotic materials and the destination.
Like, but when I saw it's a big amount of the time it was because I guess that it was not in cash because it was too large, so that there was some kind of trading payment system like a letter of credit today.
You have in the all this system, you have the intermediate people. It's not that this Chinese or let's say a Central Asian farmer knew that somebody in Spain wanted to, and then you are again. This is a topic. The Sogdians located in Bukhara and Samarkand. They want the connecting part. They traveled to the Near East. They traveled to China. They knew all the languages. There is this Jewish guild, the Radhanites, very neglected one, which is mentioned in 9th and 10th century sources, maybe based in Baghdad, and they were traveling all the way. You have evidence for this in the archives in Western China, in Dunhuang. You can illustrate this if you know this wonderful novel by Albert Yoshua, Masai Toma Elef, when he described the Jewish merchants around the 1000 traveling from North Africa to Europe. So this is the concept.
Short one. Can you say something about the extent of marine transport between the Far East and the Middle East? Aqaba, whatever. Was there any marine route?
Yeah, the route that I showed in Gideon, and which is evidenced by artifacts, many of them, that goes mainly to the Gulf countries, to Oman, to Basra, and from there they are distributed. You find them in Fustat, so it existed. This very long ship is not something exceptional, and probably the volume was much larger than the land boats. Cargo ship cannot equivalent it in prices and everything to cannon very low.
Very much once again.